Hi, and welcome to this live reading from In the Midst of Omens by Nicole Bailey, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. He came into power through blood and violence. The wolf shook his head as he cracked sticks and leaves in his sprint. The forest passed in a blur of gray and green, the cedar's sweetness filling the air. Usually memories didn't nestle into the wolf's mind, but the blood was still fresh from the attack. Another pack had descended upon his den with gnashing teeth and sharp claws. His pack overcame, but at a cost. His father had died, his thick gray fur matted down under spilled blood. Protect the pack. Don't forget your duty, he'd said with his last panting breath to the wolf. The wolf had only lived a few seasons. When the sun lengthened its time in the sky, he'd planned to leave his parents' pack, explore the forest, stretch his legs. Instead, he stepped into his father's role. In the mornings, once the pack had bedded down within the den, the new pups whimpering, silenced by their mother's comfort, the wolf ran. He ran until his breath ached his lungs and saliva oozed past his teeth, until he could taste the pine sap in the air, until the birds began their morning squalling as his ears pressed back. One more lap, and he returned to the den, to his place in life. He turned a corner, then slammed his paws into the dirt, dragging up moss as he forced himself to a halt. A human lay sleeping, bare of covering, sunlight dappling his massive body. The wolf's heart stuttered. He shuffled back a step. Normally, his nose would have warned him long before he came across a human. This one didn't have the sharp scent of hunters, though. His grassy, sweet aroma blended in with the forest. If it were another predator, he'd wrinkle his nose and growl a warning. The wolf was no coward. Already, scars marred his body from defending his territory. One lesson he'd learned well from his father, though, was that wolves did not fight humans. They stayed far from them. The wolf turned. He'd have to send out the pack's strongest hunters to survey the radius around the den. Humans rarely came so deep into the woods, and... Wait a moment. The voice was light and melodic. It rushed through the trees like a breeze, shaking pine needles free. Turning back around, he bared his teeth at the human, but the creature slept on. It's not him who's speaking to you. It's me. The wind rushed again, and the light glistened through branches. The voice came from beyond the earth. The wolf dropped to the ground and exposed his belly. Rise, wolf. I have a duty for you. Getting back to his feet, he shook leaves from his coat and stared up at the sparkling sky. The one who created all spoke to him of all beasts. You are an honored creature, indeed, wolf. I've seen your loyalty and responsibility. I need you to complete a task for me. Anything for you, Creator. This is my son. Light danced around the human lying on the forest floor. He needs someone to look after him for a time, to teach him the ways of life. One day, fate will pair him with a human king, and he must be prepared. Wolf heaved a breath, his gaze bouncing between the sleeping human and the Creator's glistening light. How can I teach a human to be a human, wise one? He already knows what he will need for his human life. He can speak their tongue. Tell him one day a woman will come bringing food. Once he accepts it, he will be gifted all the knowledge he needs for living among humans. For now, the light softened around the man curled in the dark grass. I want him to learn of duty, of life and loss and the natural way of things. These are the skills he must gain. Will you accept this calling, wolf? The wolf smacked his mouth and shifted the dirt beneath his paw. He knew nothing of humans and had no desire to learn. The Creator asked him to look after this man and teach him the forest's ways. It was one more responsibility, but he wasn't one to run away from duty. I'm honored, Creator. Thank you, Wolf. The glistening light transformed into a female human form, though her tresses were as wild as tree boughs. Her eyes like stars the wolves howled at. She brushed hair back from the man's face, tucking strands back from the horns on his head. I know you'll take good care of my son. The man's eyes opened, and with a burst of light, the Creator disappeared. Chapter 1, A Valley Dark and Quiet. Gilgamesh's axe hungered for blood, for the crunch of bones snapping beneath it and the howling cries of fallen enemies. And he didn't give a damn what his advisors thought about it. That didn't stop the advisor who joined the campaign from standing before his king with protests. Fuck if some god hadn't bewitched Gilgamesh for him to have allowed Huron to come with his men. Most of the soldiers lingered back at their campsite, but Gilgamesh's loyal hundred stood with them on a hill that looked down into a dark, quiet valley. Dozens of animal hides tents rippled in a breeze, which caused torches around the site to flicker. Gilgamesh's men leaned on their shields or rested hands on their swords. Fine blades were expensive and rare. He doubted the troops waiting for them in the valley possessed many. Every one of his 100 had one, yet Gilgamesh preferred the axe. There was something about the brutal intimacy of fighting so close, the leverage that went into the swing. When Gilgamesh killed someone, he wanted them to see his eyes as they fell. If we could delay another day and form a strategy, my king, a sigh built in Gilgamesh's chest. Campfires glowed in the distant valley, golden flecks of moving paint that smudged the not yet dark horizon. He'd ignored Huron's prattling and lost the conversation's topic. The time for action had come. What is your concern, Huron? His men shuffled behind him. They buzzed with energy, ready to fight. The advisor, who wore a colorful tunic and beaded shawl as opposed to the practical leather and linen of his soldiers, trembled. If something were to happen to you, Lugal? Gilgamesh scoffed as he chucked his bronze shield into the ground, causing dust to rise and glow in the dim illumination from the enemy's distant fires. What could possibly happen to me? He nodded to his soldiers. Huron didn't want to fight tonight. He'd rather they reconvene with the rest of their army to make a strategy, alerting their enemy and allowing them to prepare, and other foolish advisor-like ideas. Not to be indelicate, Your Highness, but you could die. Huron rubbed his hands together. Gilgamesh's nose flared. He wasn't some mortal child incapable of protecting himself. He possessed God's blood powers, and he released his hold on them, allowing the magic to flow over the man. One would think Huron might remember who he stood before as he shivered under their weight. The advisor bowed deeply, and Gilgamesh's teeth clicked. He'd allowed Huron to come because the man was loyal and well-connected. Taking a moment to reassure the advisor wouldn't delay the inevitable. Huron bowed again until he touched the ground before scrambling to his feet. Forgive me, Lugal. You know I am a weak-willed man and not made of the same metal as your fighters. His eyes dashed to the broad, muscled men. Gilgamesh stood 5 handbreadths above his tallest soldier, which signaled his god-descended nature even without others having to feel his power's weight. Huron was attempting to be respectful despite his disapproval, and Gilgamesh needed to help keep him on his side. As an advisor, he influenced a realm Gilgamesh couldn't win, though through might alone. He clapped the man's arm. Of course. Then he shifted to face the men who waited for his word. At a shake of his head, they'd retreat to the hill's other side and sleep with unbloodied hands. But they had vengeance to take. I believe our friend and advisor has forgotten who leads our group. Smiles slipped up their faces. They already knew what he'd say, but were eager to hear it again. Gilgamesh rested a palm over the axe's head. Is it a mere mortal who leads you, the most loyal men of Uruk? No! They cried and raised their swords to pierce the sky's deepening navy. Gilgamesh laughed, his chest rumbling with it. No, Huron, you need not worry, for it is no mere mortal standing here tonight. Gilgamesh grazed his hand down his beard before grinning. These fine soldiers will face down this threat alongside the great King Gilgamesh, glorious ruler of the high-walled Uruk. Battle cries rang out. son of the great king and half-god Lugalbanda and the mighty goddess Ninsun. More cheers rose into a crescendo as the sound echoed. The man who surpasses all other mortals in strength and deed. The men jumped up and down as they hoisted their shields in the air. The noise would wake the sleeping army below. Gilgamesh tightened his grip on the axe and turned towards the slope, directing his men forward. Already soldiers poured out of the tents like ants from aggravated mounds. The evening's activities had begun. You're not just a god, Lugal, Hiron whispered. His tone caused Gilgamesh to turn towards him with his nose wrinkling in a snarl. The advisor shook his head, his eyes glistening, and it cooled the king's rising anger. You're 1/3 human is all I mean, my king. We love you and wish to see you have a long, prosperous reign. The soldiers ran, their shouts echoing. Gilgamesh remained still and stared at the advisor. It was brave to speak so boldly to the god king of Uruk. There were many words Gilgamesh might have used to describe Hiram before that night, but brave would not fall among them. Perhaps when I walk out of this unscathed, you'll learn to have more faith in me. The advisor's shoulders dropped with a sigh. Gilgamesh turned and leapt down the hill. His strides were long enough that before his men met the approaching soldiers, he'd reached them.